is going to go. Yes, okay. So again, welcome everybody. Today we're going to walk through what is this new toolkit for the Global Shelter Cluster. So it's focusing very specifically if you're an information management officer or if you're a coordinator who has to design an assessment. We really hope that the resources that we've compiled from country level clusters and the tools that we have asked Reach to prepare for us or to link to in this toolkit are going to be helpful for you. So I'm going to hand over the floor to my colleague Camila from Reach, who's done a very excellent job in putting together this toolkit. So over to her, and then we'll try to do different taking questions and answers and feedback from you throughout the session. Camila?
Hello, good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you very much, Renee, for the introduction, and thanks a lot for the collaboration on this toolkit. So to introduce myself, my name is Camila Wünsch. I work with Reach in Geneva in the cluster support units and focused on shelter projects specifically. We're going to present the toolkit today. So I'm going to go over a few introductory points, introducing the key features and purpose of this toolkit, as well as the process behind it, how we developed it, and then we'll go for a quick demonstration on how to access the toolkits online. Okay, so as an introduction, what is this toolkit? What is its main content? And a few words on the background. So in a nutshell, it's a product that compiles is a set of best practice and examples of tools, templates, but also other type of key documentation that relates to information management and assessment tasks and activities that are meant to support core shelter cluster coordination functions. The overall rationale of this toolkit is not to be prescriptive, as in saying this is exactly what you have to do, but neither to be an exhaustive resource that compiles all of the tools that exist out there, but it's intended to really be a point of reference and a guide to help you get started on IM and assessment work, or just go and have a look and get inspired on different topics. So there's two parts of this toolkit, and for those of you who are familiar with the coordination toolkits, it follows the same structure, the same approach. So there are the documents themselves, which includes, as mentioned, a bunch of templates and examples in different formats, different tools. We also try to cover different languages. Most are in English, but we have a few in French and a couple in Spanish as well. And overall, they're documents that are considered best practices from country clusters. Then the second part of the toolkit is the companion, which is a document that provides a framework to the toolkit. So it introduces every document and explains why we've chosen this document, why it's in a particular section, and how it can be used for a specific activity or task. And of course, it also hyperlinks to each document themselves. So a little bit of background on this toolkit. So as Renee mentioned, this really isn't a toolkit that was developed in its own silo, but it really builds on the work that was done in the Global Shelter Cluster Coordination Toolkits early 2020 on assessments and information management. And for this, it's aligned to the CTK, both in its structure, its content, and its purpose. And it doesn't duplicate documents. It refers to those that were already present in the CTK. Why was a standalone product developed? Well, first of all, to facilitate referencing documents and navigating, just to have everything related to IM and assessments in one place, to also have a more comprehensive resource. So going beyond what is already in the Ctk, to help build capacity, and also to facilitate stock taking at country level on IM and assessment activities. Sort of, it lists all the sort of type of activities that can be conducted, so it could allow clusters to go and see, oh, this we do, this we don't do, and just get inspired. And finally, it's a product that's issued from collaboration between the Global Shelter Cluster and REACH. So what are the key features of this product? So first of all, as mentioned, the idea is to have an easy access to the toolkit and allow to access it both online and offline. So you have 3 ways to access the toolkit. The first one is through the website, which we'll show after this short presentation. So there you have 1 page per section of the toolkits and all of the documents that are compiled, sort of like a library of documents. Then, as mentioned, you can access each document through the hyperlinks that are contained in the companion document. And then finally, you can also download the full toolkit to your desktop to be able to access the documents offline. That can be useful to be able to access them offline, but then you won't have all the descriptions around each document. For that, you'd have to go back either to the website or the companion. Second key feature, as mentioned also, so this is a first version. It's not set in stone. It's meant to be a resource that will be continuously updated on a rolling basis as new guidance is produced, new tools are developed, and so on and so forth. Needs might change. There might be new processes that are put in place either in country or global levels. So it's really meant to evolve through time in alignment with needs relating to IM and assessments. So for this reason, definitely feel free to provide feedback first on this toolkit today during the session, but also later on, and in coming days, weeks, month, whenever. If you want to propose documents that you think would be a good addition, definitely invite you to do so. The process for this will be similar as the Ctk. You can upload them through proposed documents through a link that will be available on the website, and these documents will be reviewed by the Global Shelter Cluster to see if they can be added or not. Third key feature, it's country-based. So there are a few guidance notes that were produced at global level, but 95% of it is documents, resources that were produced at country level. So we try to cover as much as possible. It also aims to be comprehensive. So here you have the way the toolkit is structured, which again follows the same structure that you have in the coordination toolkits and also other key documents, I believe. So it covers the 4 phases of the cluster lifecycle, with phase 1 being activation of clusters and rapid actions in sudden onset disasters. In phase 2, you have the emergency phase, phase 3, early recovery, more durable phase, and phase 4, long-term cluster setup and phasing out. We'll get back to this, but also to point out here already that this is a way to organize the documents, but of course, documents that are in one section might be relevant later on or beforehand, and especially those that are included in early phases. And also, it's not a linear sort of phasing of cluster lifecycle and more iterative, but it's a good way of organizing the documents. So as much as possible, we try to have documents in different languages. that cover different types of crisis, so protracted, sudden onset, and produced in different geographic areas. So here there is a list of some of the countries that were covered, but there are more, and hopefully there will be more as well. So thank you to everyone who contributed or who has produced these documents. And by the way, if any one of you at some point sees a doc in this session today, sees a document that they have produced or know about and want to add a few words on them, please don't hesitate. So yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so a few words on the purpose of the toolkit. First of all, encouraging efficiency. So by this, we mean that especially when it comes to tools or templates, the idea is to help save time by having examples that are editable and that also allow to not reinvent the wheel. For example, if there's a good template for a report that is already available, you can just download it and replace the text with what you need, and so on and so forth. Same for different types of tools, Kobo forms or any other IM tool that is included. Second of all, inspire. So it's not a prescriptive resource, but it's meant to be there to serve as a starting point, guidance, and inspiration to help you in activities relating to IM and assessments. Purpose 3, it also serves, and this is especially done through the companion document, but also the texts on the website that presents each document. The goal is also to frame the different processes in terms of IM and assessment in which the documents are embedded and how these processes fit in the larger core cluster coordination functions. So in this sense, this toolkit also provides a framework to the different IM and assessment processes. Purpose number 4, the idea is to standardize within reason, again, to not be prescriptive, but the idea is to standardize, to be able to facilitate sharing of documents, to have the same, using the same words, the same terms to when referring to specific activities and so on, especially if there are support missions across different missions and so on. Oh, yeah. Different words, but similar purpose, create a common understanding of IM and assessment processes by highlighting the key resource documents, which again can facilitate the exchanges of best practices, knowledge management, both across operations, but also between operations and global. Before I keep going, if there is any question at this stage, I can't see the chats when sharing my screen, but don't hesitate. Wait. Okay, I'll keep going. So how was the toolkit developed and what are the next steps? So development process. First of all, we started off by structuring the toolkits. So this was done through terms of reference and a few versions and discussions around how to best structure the toolkit to align to the CTK, but also taking into account the way IM and assessment processes function. Then we proceeded with identifying the toolkit contents for each of the different sections of the toolkits. So this was done by identifying documents that already exist, documents that existed but needed to be refreshed, updated, and documents that needed to be developed from scratch. And we also did this through a few consultations with country teams. Then we put together the toolkits, compiled the documents, drafted new ones, then drafted the companion, so the text around each document, providing context to each of the documents and the overall framework of the toolkit. And then finally, we're now rolling out the toolkit through these webinars and then bilateral follow-up as requested. Next steps. So in the short term, so once the toolkit is uploaded and disseminated, will be available for bilateral support if you have questions on how to use it or on specific documents. Then we're also still updating some key guidance notes that will be uploaded or replaced shortly. Some are still in draft first versions and will be updated in coming days. In the medium term, there will be migration to a new website, and it will change a little bit the way the toolkit is presented. That's for later. And then in the long term, as mentioned, it's an iterative process, so there will be V2s and V3s of this toolkit in alignment with evolving processes and needs. Okay, content of the toolkit. So here I'm just gonna introduce the main sections and the subsections before we move on to showing how it's set up on the websites and how to navigate through it. So a few words on the structure. So on the right of the screen or left, I don't know how it shows, you have a little picture of the Ctk structure, just to show how that one was set up. So you see it with the 4 different phases, which of the cluster lifecycle, which we also used in for the IMS information management and assessment toolkit. So again, it's not a prescriptive structure, meaning that if you can't find a document in a specific phase that you think is where it should be, or just definitely go and check the other phases to see if it's there. There are also some documents that can overlap phases. In some cases, we've included them in several phases. In others, we've just kept them in one, but keeping in mind, of course, they can be used whenever. And yeah, so usually the documents that are included in earlier phases. So as you'll see, there's a lot of generic IM tools, activity reporting, that type of document that is presented early on, but that of course stays relevant throughout the cluster lifecycle. Same thing for secondary data reviews. And one other point on how it aligns to the Ctk is that for common subsections, this is also aligned. So if you have, for example, in-depth sectoral needs assessments in the Ctk was under phase 2, and we've kept it under phase 2 in the information management toolkit. So as much as possible, we've aligned both so that it's easier to navigate and go from one to the other. Okay, so the rationale behind the structure in terms of IM and assessment. So the idea is that in phase 1, you need to set up basic IM functions and have initial assessment capacity. In phase 2, can start being a bit more advanced IM functions and more advanced assessment and analysis approach. In phase 3, IM advanced functions as well, and potentially more topic-specific assessment and analysis, going more in depth on some very specific technical topics. And then in phase 4, it's setting up long-term and routine IM tasks and assessments that can continue even after, if needed, a cluster might leave a country or in very long protracted crisis. So in phase 1, so on activation and rapid actions, so we have 5 sections. The first one covers IM strategies, framework, work plans. So in short, it includes all documents that can serve as a backbone and frame your IM and assessment activities in country. In section B, you have IM, we call generic tools. So useful basic IM tools and things like visibility, communication guidelines, admin tools, blank templates, and so on and so forth. In section C's, we go into Imo Roles and Responsibilities, and we did this by including some generic TORs, both from the shelter cluster, from REACH, and also but only accessible internally from UNHCR. Then in section D, we look at activity reporting, so the basic activity reporting, so W matrices, which is one of the most important documents for efficient cluster coordination, as you all well know. And then section E, we look at documents for initial situation analysis. So how are you able to rapidly assess a situation following a sudden onset crisis?
Maybe Camila, you can mention on the content because some of these are covered in the coordination toolkit. Maybe you can mention what are some of the new tools and templates that are included in each of these sections, particularly the ones that you designed as REACH.
Yeah, sure. So indeed, I think section A, D, and E are all in the coordination toolkits. So in section A, we've uploaded a IM strategy guidance note. So in addition to examples that were already present in the Ctk, there's also now a guidance note that just outlines what are the different sections that should be included in an IM strategy, and advice on how to go about it in developing this strategy. The IM generic tools, some of them are also in the Ctk, but we've added quite a few, called them visibility templates. So InDesign blank fact sheets and reports, QGIS, Power BI templates as well, things like this. The IMO roles and responsibilities, that's a new section. In activity reporting, it takes what is already in the Ctk, but we added a few documents in there as well. Top of my head, I can't remember exactly which ones were already in the Ctk or not, but we can go over it when I show you the website. And in the last one, we've added quite a few examples of dashboards and maps that can be created following sudden onset crisis or rapid assessment. And yes, that's the one. In the initial situation analysis, we also cover everything related to secondary data reviews. Second phase, little typo, should say 2, emergency phase. So here we look at assessment strategies. First of all, that's new. So it's a guidance, mainly a guidance document that explains how to go more in depth when developing cluster strategies on the assessment component. So anticipating ahead of a response, be it within an HPC or not, anticipating needs in relation to assessments, and a bunch of other important key features about coordinating assessments from a shelter cluster perspective. In section B, core indicators, that's already in the Ctk, but we added a few external sources relating to, by external, I mean external to the Global Shelter Cluster core indicator guidelines, a few resources that compile shelter indicators. Section C, which is quite huge, it has several document best practice assessments, examples covering all sorts of topics. But then we also quite developed within this section, a section that has guidance for every step of the research design, assessment design. And most are from REACH. And then finally, response monitoring and gap analysis. That's also in the CTK, but we added quite a bit of documents and examples as well.
So there's a question in the chat from Elsa. Elsa, would you like to say your question out loud?
Yes, thank you. So this is Elsa from the Field Information Services section at OCHA. And what came to my mind in this content phase 1 and also relevant to content phase 2 is that these templates, I don't know, I haven't yet checked what kind of templates they are available, but have they been tested in, for example, if we think about tools like QGIS or Power BI, which are really great tools, but sometimes a little thing can really, such as a spelling mistake or something like this, can really take a lot of time to do the workaround and then will frustrate the IAM officers and anyone else. So I was wondering if these have been tested and then and evaluated by the real users, and is there also ongoing testing so that they can be optimized for the situation and minimize this kind of frustrations caused by little things. And also as new versions come in and they may, for example, in Power BI, a new version may support something that the old version didn't and vice versa. So to optimize the use of templates and make them really like templates that are ready to use and really something that will significantly save the time of the IMO and this way the whole decision-making process. Thank you very much.
Yes, so that's a really good point, especially for templates that use specific data sets that may not be present on a computer. So then when you open it, it says there's a file missing. So that's a really good point. So what we try to do is to make available templates, for example, InDesign, that are almost blank, but what they have is, for example, the color palette is embedded in the document. The different fonts that should be used are embedded, and things like this, so that at least the process of like having to recreate all the different colors that are specific to shelter cluster visibility, that's already done. And then, of course, there are examples. So they are maybe for someone who may not want to think too much about how to set up a page, they can just use the setup how it is. But then, of course, it's a good point, like for things like Power BI, especially in maps, there's so many ways of organizing the different items that, it could be.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Elsa. It's a really good one. I think for us as a shelter cluster, I think, yeah, the toolkit corresponds to two phases, is some of the contextualization. So we definitely try to include how countries have adjusted to the reality of data cleaning and then producing. Of course, there's a lot of human reading involved in shelter responses, particularly when we talk about the planning cycle that you might, in more advanced contexts, it may be that you plan to rebuild so many shelters, but because of unforeseen situations, you might have to adjust that. So we've definitely tried to put that into some of the more specific guidance. But for us, we've been missing for a couple of years as people are using Power BI more often and they're using GIS. And also in design, we've been missing kind of those standard templates. So this also should just save time for IMOs when they need to use those templates. So it's a first step, but I think also something to keep track of when we consider future iterations and how, especially, we have a lot from the conflict side, but possibly on the next iteration to get more from the natural disaster side. There's another question in the chat from Thomas. Would you like to say your question out loud?
Okay. I'm in FIS in OCHA, it's the same group as ELSA. We would be thrilled if there's some reference to common operational data sets to help with sharing and mingling and meshing shelter information with other assessments. Over.
Sorry, are you referring to the the CODs, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we actually in section, I think it's 3. Yeah, in 3B, it's not in there. We link to the OCHA IM toolbox.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yep. Oh.
Yeah, and I think also just to add, I think that's also a really good point in terms of where we really struggle, Thomas, as a sector is in terms of settlement level, particularly in new situations. So even in the Sahel right now, where we talk about Burkina Faso and the setting up of new settlements. So I think it's something to also consider in future iterations of the template of how we address that in different contexts. I think even with the Northwest Syria situation this past year, that also became somewhat of a challenge, and it's something also that's common to CCCM cluster and somebody who we liaise with quite a bit. But it's a really good insight. Thank you. Back over to you, Camila.
Okay, so for phase 3, we cover so relating to more early recovery, more durable phases. We cover in section A, PIN calculations and severity, so relating to the HNO with a few examples from country teams that may have used GF type of methodology to calculate their PINs. Then a section that is common also to the CTK is the one on cluster performance tools and ongoing gap analysis. So we just link to it again to have it in this toolkit. For advocacy and reporting, there's all sorts of documents that can be used for this. So be it reports from needs assessments or from gap analysis and so on. So we put a few examples of the type of documents that can be used for advocacy and reporting, but it's quite broad and it depends on the needs you have. And then finally, we go into early recovery, multi or sector specific assessments. So a few examples of more topic specific assessments that can be conducted. And then finally, in phase 4, so we cover 2 different points. The first one is IM and assessment capacity building. So what we did here is take several IM trainings that haven't necessarily been produced for phasing out phases or long-term setup, but we thought it'd be interesting to have it in this toolkit in phase 4 to really emphasize this point about the importance to build capacity in later stages of cluster lifecycle. And then there's also, similar to the CTK, a couple of resources, examples from Ukraine of phasing out of IM functions. Okay, I think that's it for the presentations. If there are any questions, otherwise I will move on to the demo. I find it. Okay. Is my screen showing? Just to double check. Guess so. Okay, so here I'm going to go over the contents of the toolkits without going into detail for each document resource because there's over 100, but just to show you how to navigate through the toolkit, where the different sections are, and so on and so forth. And again, for those of you who are familiar with the Ctk, you'll see it's basically the same structure. So this is the main page, the landing page for the toolkit. So it introduces the toolkit, presents the different purpose of the toolkits, which I mentioned before. The toolkits, different parts of it. So here we will be linking to the companion of the toolkits, that separate document, which essentially is a version. It takes all of the website different pages, text with a bit more text, and is published as a report type of document. And then the documents themselves. So what we'll also do here is link to a zip archive of the Dropbox file that has all of the documents. Here on the left, you can access each page separately. So either from here or from the this landing page. So it has all of the different sections, phases, and sections that I presented before. And here we have the different documents that are new and that we've added, and we'll be adding also the companion document to this page. Okay, so if we start with activation and rapid actions. So here, as mentioned, so here we have all of the documents that would need to be, that would support all of the tasks and activities that would need to be set up following in a context of a rapid response or following sudden onset crisis. But then, of course, the documents that are produced earlier on, because they cover the basics, will be useful throughout the full cluster lifecycle. So here you have really most of the documents that serve as a backbone to the IAM function. So in the first page, so the way it's set up is there's a quick introduction to the subsection. Here you have the link to the phase in which it's set, and then a list of documents. There's 3 different ways in which the documents are presented. They are either documents that were already present on the Shelter Cluster website, and these are most of the documents that have already been produced by country teams and uploaded. So we relink to them here. Then you have the new documents that were newly uploaded. And then in some cases, it's not the case here, but we'll see it later, we have external links. So documents that are hosted on different websites that are for which we provide a hyperlink. So here in this section, you have that IAM strategy guidance document that I mentioned. It's still in draft mode, but it's a couple of notes to just explain why IAM strategy is important and some key features of it. Then here we have 2 examples from Yemen and Syria that were already present in the Ctk. And there's also an example in French from Chad, where the shelter cluster is merged with the CCCM cluster. So it's a common strategy to both. And then there's also this document from the global shelter cluster, which show you quickly, which outlines all of the different, which lists all of the different activities, tools, processes, and resources for IAM. So it's a useful tool that you can use to benchmark and stock take if needed, especially ahead of drafting an IM strategy. Okay, in section 1B, this is where we compile all of the generic tools. So we have the visibility templates that we talked about. So InDesign, Power BI, QGIS templates. There's also a relink to the Shelter Cluster website cheat sheets to guide you through uploading documents to the websites, which I've also had to learn recently. So it's a very useful document. Then we link to an example of two different websites. One, so for in the Philippines, that was set up following the typhoon back in November. So an example of a website that is set up following a sudden onset crisis. And one, so we link to Iraq, which is in a protracted crisis. Then we also have templates for admin type documents, contact lists, minutes of meeting, handover notes, and so on and so forth. And the main purpose of having these documents is to remind of the importance of filing these documents and keeping them updated. But of course, they're not prescriptive templates. And then we link to a bunch of, that are here as well, of external tools and platforms that can be useful for IM tasks. So all those from Kobo, other survey forms, activity info, ArcGIS, QGIS training material, and HDX. But there are many others. Feel free to propose if you think we should be adding other key ones. Okay, that's for 1B. So 1C, IMO roles and responsibilities. So as mentioned, we have several terms of references, generic ones. So the two that are here are from the Shelter Cluster website. Then we have a couple from UNHCR that are internal, so accessible for those who have access. And then a couple from REACH for GIS specialist, generic TOR, and assessment specialist. Okay. Activity reporting. So here we have, which is also already in the CTK, this brief note from the Global Shelter Cluster that explains why activity reporting is necessary. So sort of guidance notes, point of reference. Then a few examples of W matrices, which the first two were already in the CTK. The one from Northwest Syria was added for this toolkit, which also, this W matrix is accompanied by a brief user guide that explains how to update the 4W. So it can be an interesting example on how to documents to help with the updating of the W matrix. Then, so these are the tools to track activity. Then what we did was add a few examples of the type of outputs that can be produced using that information. So we linked here to, for example, as mentioned before, dashboard, but there are many examples, but this was one that's been produced recently. The dashboard on activity tracking that was developed in the Philippines following the typhoon in November. A couple of pages. Then with the files accessible in the Dropbox, if you want to see the document behind. And then also we linked to the Global Shelter Cluster page where all of the operations fact sheets are compiled with the link to guidance to develop these fact sheets. Here, this is a brief note on why Excel continues to be a great tool for activity tracking, even if there's other types of tools that exist. Just a small briefer on that. Okay, that's for 1D. For 1E, some initial situation analysis documents. So here again, linking to a document from the Philippines following the typhoon in November. And this time it links to a map. Yeah, here it is. That was produced using some very early on information that was available. And really collecting just 2-3 key pieces of information and developing a map to process the initial situation. Then we have some different guidance notes on secondary data reviews from ACAPS, UNHCR, and GIPS. And the intention is also to produce a short brief on specifically rapid SDRs when you don't have time to conduct a full SDR, which can take weeks. Here are a few examples of Sdr outputs. So these are report types on the first bullet point. And the second one is different types of outputs that can be produced following SDR. Here you have a dashboard that's registered assessments from Syria and a document that tracks shelter types. Okay, I will accelerate a little bit just to not take too much of your time. So in phase 2, first section is on the assessment strategies. So as mentioned, there's a short guidance note also in draft mode, but already a good starting point that explains the importance and the idea behind planning out a strategy for assessments during the strategy development. And then a couple of other documents relinking to shelter cluster strategies, because of course it's always important to have the two together. Okay, 2A, 2B. This is where we link to core indicators. So you have the Global Shelter Cluster core indicator guidelines, and then a few other resources, the Sphere standards, the humanitarian indicators that are available on the OCHA services website, and a link to the GF indicators from 2020, keeping in mind that these might be revised this year for the next H&O season. Okay, this section on assessments is really long, so I'm not going to go through all of it, but in short, you have examples of assessments and the different parts of it, so TORs, data collection tools, reports, for assessments that are specific to shelter. Assessments, maybe just to point out, most are from Shelter Cluster done in partnership with REACH or other partners, but then we have a few external sources as well, including the UNDP Housing and Building Damage Assessment Tool and Guidance that was developed in partnership with REACH in 2019. And also it mentions the UNHCR Shelter and Settlement Toolbox and Training, which is available upon request to UNHCR. Then we have links to joint multi-sector assessments, so MSNAs, but also the IOM and the settlement approach guidance notes developed by the Urban Settlements Working Group. Then we have a few points on cross-cutting assessments, which aren't per se, for GBV isn't per se assessments, but we link to important documents from the GBV working group to remind that the GBV component should be mainstreamed when conducting SNFI assessments, and also some important things to keep in mind when conducting assessments. But then we link to one example of an FGD that was conducted in Niger, which has a GBV angle. And then examples of market assessments. And finally, a section that links to all of the assessment guidelines. As mentioned before, we have all those from REACH, impact, the Global Shelter Cluster assessment guidelines that are currently undergoing some revisions, and the UNHCR Needs Assessment Handbook.
Just to compliment it, this page tends to be the most meaty. If you've seen the revision that was done last year to the 2020 revision to the Shelter Cluster Coordination Toolkit, you'll see that this section, the similar section, has a number of resources which are in Dropbox links that includes questionnaires, reports, broken down in each of the main areas of natural disaster, conflict, protracted, market, as Camila was highlighting. So here we wanted to make it also just a bit more specific, that based off of that collection of good practices, frequent issues that come up when designing assessments. So how to interact with data tracking matrices that are being done a lot in IDP contexts, how to do the assessment design. There's a lot of new resources that came out with country level clusters in this last year on remote data collection, etc. So yeah, this page we tried to link all those things, but it's still a very meaty page, but has a lot of synergies with that section in the coordination toolkit.
Thanks for that. All right. Okay. 2D response monitoring and gap analysis. Here, it picks up on the section 1D on activity reporting and includes a bunch of other documents that have and tools and that have as an objective to monitor and measure progress against objectives that were set up in the shelter response, both at strategic, programmatic, and operational levels. So here, for example, you have links to PDM tools and reports. Then we have links to a bunch of different tools, including surveys from the Venezuela cluster, a couple of tools that were developed by the Sudan Shelter Cluster last year, will be piloted this year, that measure, intend to measure stock and pipeline gaps and track gap analysis tool. I have a form from Chad, a tool from Burkina that tracks the presence and capacity of local actors, and a couple of tools from Syria on the winterization response and stocks as well. As in section D, these tools are followed by a few examples of the type of outputs that can be produced using the data from the response monitoring tools. Phase 3. Here, as mentioned, we have a few examples, couple of examples of shelter cluster methodologies using GF type methodologies to calculate their pins. So one from Niger and one from Yemen. And then we relink to the GF indicators. And the idea of this is just to, although might change a bit this year, to just, it's important to keep track of what is happening at the intersector level, because sector IMOs will be involved in intersector processes, are involved. In 3B, the humanitarian response plan. Oh yeah, this is where we link to the IM toolbox. And then we have a few examples from Iraq and Chad and I believe, yeah, Ukraine, on how to prioritize, do prioritizations for the HRP.
Yeah, so these are basic project tables that when you might do an extract of the criteria of your partner's projects from for the humanitarian program cycle, a way that IMOs can prepare for that discussion if you have a vetting of those projects at SAG level. So those are some basic examples of the different indicators involved, and then also you can download those and then cater it to your needs depending on the HRP specific criteria.
Okay. In 3C, so as mentioned, this is where we link to, as in the CTK, to the cluster coordination performance monitoring tools, and then have a couple of examples of the type of outputs, one from Chad and one from Ukraine, that can be produced following this cluster performance review.
Yeah, so here the idea for the CCPM is also you can do the CCPM with a basic tool that was designed at the Intercluster Information Management Working Group, which goes through all the different core functions and how they're doing. So a lot of countries do that. So we've collected basically a link to many different clusters examples on the Cluster Coordination Performance Monitoring resource page. So there's the link there. There's, of course, a qualitative way that you can do this as well. So we included an example from Chad there, but then also it's possible to do independent evaluation. So this is why we included this really good example from Ukraine from 2015, that they designed their own survey, they did key informants, they did field observation. So there's different ways that you can evaluate the performance of the cluster, and that turned up a number of good recommendations for the cluster there. So you can also look at that and use pieces of it or use all of it to design your own cluster kind of assessment.
In section 3D, yes, so as mentioned before, this is really where for advocacy and reporting, where it will really depend on the type of needs you have. So you can use reports, outputs from assessments, you can use outputs from response monitoring, and so on and so forth. But here we linked to the, as in 2D, to the Syria, the border operation in Turkey, Syria, and the Burkina monthly fact sheets as examples. And then finally, for the last section of phase 3, we added a couple of topics for sector sector-specific assessments. So the first topic is the one is on HLP, but to point out and to note that we included HLP here because we're referring to examples that really did in-depth HLP assessments, but it's important to keep in mind that HLP considerations have to be taken into account as of phase 1. So it's not because it's in phase 3 in the toolkits that it's not relevant before. So we have guidance from the HLP AOR, and then an example of an assessment that was conducted in Iraq on HLP and documentation with the protection cluster. Next, we have a couple of assessments from Afghanistan. The first one is one that is being launched by REACH and is technical, focused on the shelter types and materials. So it really goes into the technical aspects of shelters. And then a second one that was conducted by NRC and Mobile Studio that also looks at the architecture and technical component of shelters. And here, as in the CTK, we also finally linked to different databases, one from Iraq, one from Ukraine, that can be produced to track damaged houses and building across time.
Camila, there's a question from Mohammed. Mohammed, do you want to say your question out loud?
Yes, thanks, Camilla and Renee, about this great job. Really, I find a lot of helpful templates and reporting you publish it, and thank you very much about that. My question about, I think we have good quantity and quality of data collection tools and assessment in this toolkits, but I face maybe some problems when we need to produce the things like the dashboard. I personally use Tableau to produce the dashboard and upload it to the Global Shelter website. But is my question about the structure of the dashboard. When I try to ask, I need to prepare a dashboard related to COVID-19 pandemic and what the effect on the shelter sector. Really, I try to scan or search about this type of dashboards, structural dashboard to publish it here in Palestine. I am the information, sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I am the information senior officer in Palestine, in Shelter Cluster Palestine. I face some problems to find a standard dashboard to publish the COVID-19 responses and gaps and what's the needed. I think this my question only about, is there any standard for producing this data we collected? We have a standard for the fact sheet, but what about the other reports and related to HNO or related to HRB or related to COVID-19 dashboards? Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I guess it's, I mean, it really depends what your needs are in country on the information that you need to show. But one option would be to have a dashboard that has several pages. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the Iraq one is like that. And you could have, for example, on the first page, you show, you have like a basic W matrix, and then the next page you can show assessments, and the one after you show COVID specific response. So that way you compile everything into one document. It is true that there are many different processes. HNO is very separate from, well, very separate in terms of tools from response monitoring and all that. But in terms of how you visualize the data and the information you have, you can choose to compile it into single documents, I would say. And in this toolkit, but definitely feel free to reach out after. We can also look together at specific examples. There are examples of dashboards that compile different types of information. Over.
Thank you, Camilla.
Okay, so very briefly, this is a very short section. Phase 4. So we have the section that I mentioned where we focused on IM and assessment capacity building. So here there is a few links to different types of trainings that exist that have been produced either by shelter clusters or external ones, for example, UNHCR, or there's one also on needs assessment from the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative and Kobo Toolbox. So this is really to serve as a point of reference for type of trainings and so on that you can set up for long-term capacity building in terms of IM. But again, these could be also relevant in earlier phases. So definitely don't.
I think the thought here is also just in our experience, when we do get to capacity building and localization, we don't really have so-called examples where we have documented the training that we do one-on-one with authorities or with local actors. But a lot of times when shelter clusters are trying to do that capacity building, they kind of have to go back to looking at these basic COBO training. But the idea here is you want to think about how you design tools in the earlier phases and how you want to make them sustainable. So this is something that maybe we didn't put it so concretely into words, but I think that's a lot of the lessons learned that come out from shelter clusters over the years, is that sometimes we may design something that's really cool for us and easy to manage, but if we're not able to hand that over to local actors to use in better coordination of the response, then it might not be the greatest tool. So I think this is also kind of the idea, is that we do kind of have to go back to the drawing board when building the capacity of local actors in the response in this area of needs assessment and information management. So.
Thanks, Renee. And final section, which is common to the CTK. It's linking to these documents that were produced in Ukraine for IM phasing out with the government.
In this section, it's a bit light because, we don't have so many, documented good examples. But I think also here, what's key about this stage is that you kind of need joint buy-in from, not only shelter cluster, but other sectors as well. And so this is the example of the portal that was created in Ukraine, had the involvement of the World Bank and OCHA and other sectors to kind of translate that data over time. So I think there will be more examples coming out in future iterations of this toolkit, but we don't have a great amount as of this stage, but I anticipate within the next year or so there'll be many more examples. And then also, if your cluster has done more to do this kind of capacity building, particularly on the natural disasters side, please don't hesitate to contact us so we can include it.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's it for me. Thanks a lot. That was a bit long, but any question?
And possibly any feedback as well to the toolkit, any reactions maybe? Because this is our time to also kind of consult. We have this week, so I've shared the link in the chat to this, where the landing page is now. Camila and I will be putting some final touches on it this week. So any kind of feedback that you think is useful. And then, of course, consistent with the coordination toolkit, it's always being updated. There's always new things that you guys are learning at country level that's useful for us to put in the toolkit. And so some of these tools were designed in the last year. There's some agencies that are like UNHCR and IOM are working on some resources that are going to be published within the next year. So those will be added. So any kind of feedback or suggestions for future iterations, we're really happy to hear them now. You can either raise your hand or put it in the chat. All right. Okay, I'm not seeing any reactions so far.
There's one raise. Oh, Ari, hi. You have your hand raised.
Yes. Yeah, I just had a quick question. Given that there's quite a lot of country examples here, are there going to be sort of country specific will this also be cataloging like country-specific examples, or are those sort of there as sort of an idealized example of global tools? Over.
Yeah, so kind of the theory, I can take a stab and then Camila, feel free to complement. So kind of the theory behind both the coordination toolkit and this is that we've created, you know, kind of global templates because there's good practices that are common between countries, but ultimately, particularly with shelter, there's always going to be a great deal of contextualization involved, and tools that may work in one country, you know, may not work in another. So this is why, as much as possible, we've tried to have a balance of like English and French, and then also, you know, Africa and maybe Europe or the Middle East. And so, yeah, we try to be representative that way because really there's always going to be tweaking that you might need to do in your context. So that's the theory behind kind of both the toolkit approaches, is to say, here are some really good examples of what countries did. Maybe you can download those examples and then contextualize them better to your context, if that answers your question. So the toolkits is kind of a collection of that, but of course there's infinite examples. Even on the post-distribution monitoring page, there was already quite a comprehensive collection of tools from Somalia and from many places that were created in 2020. So even if they're not called out on the page, you can click on the links and then they'll lead you to a Dropbox, which will give you countless country examples from all over. So that comes from both the coordination toolkit and this exercise. So the tools that we kind of call out are ones that maybe were created in the last 6 months, but the ones that are in the Dropbox, maybe they were created even a year ago. And with the evolving situations in many countries, that's kind of how the collection has come about.
Yeah, and maybe also to add, if there is like precisely a very specific tool that is very specific to a context that we may not have included, definitely feel free to share. I'm also showing, yeah, here, no, that's not the correct one. But yeah, for some links, we are linking to, maybe, yeah, let's take this one.
Tools. It's the tools, I think, is the.
Yes, right, because PDNs don't have a lot. Yeah, so as Renee was saying here, we link to a collection of PDM tools. So this is a bit more exhaustive than other types of tools.
Okay, I see a question from Bo in the chat. Bo, would you like to say your question out loud?
Thanks, Renee. Yes. I was wondering about the website that you were mentioning earlier, like your wiki kind of platform. If you can maybe elaborate a little bit on the planned move to another platform, and if it will also apply to the coordination toolkit. Specifically looking at what kind of functionality I guess you're going to utilize there. Yeah, so
this wiki platform, so basically what's going on with the Shelter Cluster website right now, and it's a pity because Neil will be in the Thursday session to go into more detail on the future of the cluster website. So basically the idea is that the Drupal format on which the Shelter Cluster is based is going to go through a migration period. So that's going to kind of change the features and kind of bring our Shelter Cluster website into a more modern format. So if you look at the kind of OCHA toolbox or the Watch Cluster toolbox, the wiki format, it'll just be easier to read. So for example, you can click on, like now you see particularly this page, response monitoring and analysis, and also 2C. They're very long pages and they're all there, but perhaps you don't want all of those pages open. You could click on emergency phase, and then the fields beneath the emergency phase will collapse or shrink depending on it. So it'll be more kind of like a cascading approach, which will just make the format a little bit more user friendly. I mean, it's similar to how the pages are structured, this concept of kind of main pages and then child pages, those things will kind of be, almost like a filtering capacity is how I understand it. So this migration is happening over the next several months. And then we'll see how that, also for the shelter cluster IMOs, it might make it a more friendlier for you to modify your pages, etc. But I'm not sure the exact timeline, but I think that's going to be a little bit of the principles behind it.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, just to confirm, it's only applicable to the toolkits and not to the rest of the website.
It might be applicable to the rest of the website. So this is why, also just to say on the section of 1, where we have the cheat sheet that we created for the 2020 revision of the coordination toolkit, we haven't done a revision of that cheat sheet yet, even if there's new features on the website. So we have a lot more integration with you can download the shelter cluster application. There's a lot of new features. I would recommend to check out the Global Shelter Cluster NFI working group page where we're piloting some of those features. So there will be, we can apply this to different types of pages. Perhaps on the Thursday session, though, Neil can say a lot more about what the vision is for that. So we're always doing updates to the shelter cluster website just to make it a bit more user friendly and a little bit more easier to use in different responses. So I don't want to say definitively, as that is much more Neil's area of expertise than mine at this stage.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Right. Ari, is that an old hand?
No, just one more question.
Okay, yes, go ahead.
Which is just, so basically, and this is, I think, a little country specific, so it may not be applicable, but just in Afghanistan, a lot of our work, which is done directly with the shelter cluster, has been like a lot of new and I would describe as pretty novel assessments. And I don't think there's a lot of precedent for them at a global level or in other countries. But kind of as these things are done, and if they're picked up by global or they're seen as possibly being relevant in other places, are these things that could possibly be added to this if at least the Dropbox, if not the broader website?
Yes. Yeah, so on that point, similar to the coordination toolkit, so while we make the finishing touches on this toolkit, we're going to be putting a link for you as country level clusters or from like reach teams that are supporting the shelter cluster to upload a good example to a separate Dropbox folder, and then we'll ask you to write, maybe a brief paragraph about why you think this is a good example, and then we'll consider it for future iterations. So we always welcome contributions because, yeah, especially as the Global Shelter Cluster team, we see a lot of good examples all the time. Or we may have even been involved when we go on mission in some of these tools. So it's not possible, all the time for us to see everything. So that's why we'll add that link so that you can share with us some best practices from your country. If that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Okay, I'm just making sure I didn't miss anything in the chat. And yeah, I think going back, Elsa made a good point about the usability of some of the tools that we design. And I think that's also something that we're trying to encourage through this tool, is that, yeah, you ultimately may need to make sure that you do have accountability to your partners, that maybe it's a cool tool in one context, but if it's not serving the actual response and facilitating the decision making and collaboration and coordination between partners, maybe you need to have a look at that tool ahead. And I think that's one thing that I've certainly seen after doing the coordination toolkit revision last year from this year. that some of the good examples that we previously included in the coordination toolkit, those countries have also taken a good look based off of the evolving situations in their own countries. So, for example, the cross-border context, they, based off of what was going on with the escalation last year, they took a good look at how the template was for the 4W tool that they had, and then also again at how they displayed information in the Power BI. So you even see between the different iterations we have of the coordination toolkit and then probably the different iterations that we'll have for the information management and assessment toolkit, the learnings that go on in countries over time. And I think that's also why we have this phased approach, because of course what you have maybe in one stage of the response doesn't hold all the way through maybe to the end of your response or 5 years into your response. So there's always updates and learnings that you guys are doing at country level. And so we try to capture those processes and thinking within this coordination toolkit itself. So yes, thank you very much, everybody, for your active participation today. We very much appreciated it. And then also as a global shelter cluster, I'd like to thank again Reach and particularly Camila for her very hard work on this toolkit. It's very much appreciative. And then we look forward to engaging with you as you start to pilot some of these tools and as you start to explore the links and the different features of the website in your own responses. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, everyone. Thanks, Renee.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks you all and bye.